Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to paint some Napoleonic Highlanders by Vitrix. And we're going to use the highly controversial, but always fast and effective, Zenithal painting method. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors.
Hi, it's Fitz with Slapchop. You're going to be in a great mood all day because you're going to be slapping your troubles away with the Slapchop. Now,
Slapchop? Slapchop, contrast painting, Zenithal painting. No matter what you call it, it's taking the wargaming world by storm. Some people love it, some hate it. Some say it's the key to getting your models painted fast. Others say it's nothing special. And from my point of view, it's also simply not all that new. The idea of using gray and white tones by dry brushing them onto a surface to create a gradient for highlighting is just not revolutionary. I'm 47 years old. I started painting models seriously at about age 12, and back then we knew about this. In fact, I still have some old GW acrylic inks that were marketed for the same purpose in my collection that I must have got when I was in high school. Over time, the Zenithal method has fallen in and out of favor, using either ink or acrylic paint glazes applied over a dry brush foundation. Most experienced painters keep this technique in their toolkit and use it occasionally when the need arises. When the contrast range of paints launched from GW, I did what I figured anybody else in my boat would do. I ignored them. Contrast paints seemed to be, at least to me, an answer to a question that had been asked a long time ago and had long since been answered by rendering any old ink or acrylic paint into a glaze. But a year or two on into the sensation, Army Painter and Vallejo have now both announced their line of Zenithal paints. Also, my YouTube suggestions have become clogged with Slapchop paint method tutorials, amongst others. But ultimately, it's all some form of Zenithal painting, no matter what you call it. Nothing new, nothing special. Except, I now freely admit, I missed something. You see, it's not the technique that's new. It's the products. While shopping at Torchlight Hobbies the other day, Sarah Ann recommended to me that I should try the Army Painter speed paints. Now, Sarah Ann is a good painter, so I know that if she says it's a good product, then it is. So I picked up a blue, red, and white bottle and gave them a try. Now, it's a few days later, and I freely state that I stand corrected. My assumption about Zenithal products were for the most part simply wrong. The new paints out there, like the Army Painter speed paints, take an old process and just make it, gooder, I guess. Now it's time to show you how I use this method to speed up my Napoleonics painting. Is this Slapchop, or whatever else you want to call it? I don't really know, but it's quick and effective, and that's always a good thing. Let's get out some of Vitrix's awesome Highlanders and get down to work. Please support us by subscribing on Patreon. Our subscribers receive a 5% discount on paint and building supplies from Torchlight Games, promotional products from Event Horizon Hobbies, free access to 3D print files, and a whole lot more. If you wish to make a one-time donation, click the button for Super Thanks. After assembling a batch of 7 models and supergluing the bases to a nail, I undercoated them with a generic gray rattle can primer. Why gray? Because I didn't have black at the time. I also find gray helps the colors pop a little more when painting Napoleonics, where you want the bright uniform color to be the star of the show. At this point, to boost the depth of the model, I gave them each a wash of Army Painter Darktone shader. When the shader was dry, it was time to go in and exaggerate the contrast. First up, I applied a dry brush of silver gray, followed by a light dry brush of white. The result was pretty striking, and the variation from the shadows to the highlights did look pretty extreme, but cool. Grabbing my bottle of Speed Painter Slaughter Red, I now went over the jackets, socks, and headbands. I let this settle, showing the darker depths and also the lighter highlights that came through it. This kind of felt like applying a base color and one or two midtones at the same time. Pretty nifty. Now it was time to do the kilts, but to my horror, I realized I didn't have any green speed paints. So I did what I've always done. Grabbed an olive green airbrush paint and cut it with about 25% water and a healthy amount of airbrush flow improver. Then I just went ahead and brushed it on. This functioned as a heavy glaze, and it creates a similar result to the speed paints. Notice I said similar, because, as I mentioned previously, paint glazes and inks just aren't as good as the modern lines of Zenithal paints. At this point, I decided to tackle the black areas. I used NATO Black airbrush paint and mixed it just as I did for the green, then brushed it onto the packs and shoes. By now, the Slaughter Red had dried, and I noticed that it had shaded pretty well, but the highlights still needed a little boost. I mixed Slaughter Red with Flat Flesh and applied a true highlight over the folds in the jackets. This is when I noticed an interesting effect. Army Painter speed paints are often criticized because they reactivate when layers go over top of them, and for the most part, this is kind of a pain. But when I applied the highlights, the bottom layers subtly blended with the top ones and made a really pleasant, smooth effect. Generally, you would need to do wet blending to do this, but I just did a normal highlight using the flat or very tip of my brush. There comes a time in each project when you just have to go old school. So I decided to layer paint the skin tones and the musket. This called for a dark base color, so I blocked these areas in flat brown. On the face and hands, I followed up with a layer of flat flesh. I painted it everywhere but the dark recesses. Then I placed a very precise highlight of light flesh on the nose, cheekbones, and anywhere the light would hit the face directly. When this was complete, a coat of Army Painter Flesh Wash tied the gradients together and darkened the shadows. Now I went on to finish the musket. I used a beige midtone and then an old wood highlight. Here I arrived at the detail on the kilt. And honestly, I didn't much feel like painting an intricate tartan pattern on each model. Instead, I painted a fine grid pattern in white on the front of each kilt. Next, I mixed a flat yellow into a wash by adding medium and airbrush flow improver to it. This created a very transparent yellow tint, which I carefully brushed over the grid. I also applied the same yellow to the uniform cuffs. The metallics were next. I painted the rifle barrels gunmetal and put gold onto the musket furniture. This all dried a little bright for my liking, so I toned it down along with the wood on the musket using a wash of Army Painter Strongtone. As mentioned previously, the Army Painter speed paints can reactivate, and this worried me for the following steps. Because of this, I gave the models a coat of satin varnish. This would stop the paint from running, and also protect the previous layers from the enamel panel liner, which I was about to use. Speaking of this, if you've never used panel liner, you're missing out. It's simply the easiest way to line a model in. It has low surface tension, so it flows to the low points on the model. Using the brush that comes right in the bottle, I used it to pick out the edges of the model's gear and placed it in the shadowed areas. Now I was done with the lining in, so I cleaned up a few flaws here and there on the model's gear using pure white. Finally, I went on to do basing. I've covered this in another video, and I'll link it above, so I won't get into it here. And with that, this project is done. Now I have a very scary batch of Scottish warriors to march to the tune of the bagpipes and to fearlessly meet the forces of the Emperor head to head. I must admit, I was honestly very pleased with the outcome of these models, and I can be assured now that I'm a new believer in the Zenithal painting method, due mainly in part to how well the Army Painter speed paints worked. I'm sure as my confidence grows, I will increase the amount you'll see these speed paints being used in the future. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to subscribe, press the bell button so you get immediate notification on our videos, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.